Welcome back to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be exploring how our well-being shapes our experience of fulfillment. We've got a really interesting document we're going to be looking at that kind of breaks down this connection in a really practical way.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how this document looks at it, not just in terms of what it is, but how we get there.
It gets into the nitty-gritty of the mind-body connection, the difference between just fleeting pleasure and that deeper sense of contentment that we all crave, and then why sleep and recovery are just so crucial.
Yeah. I think one of the things I like about this document is it really moves fulfillment away from something abstract. It connects it right to the ground,
Yeah.
the concrete things that we do with our minds and our bodies every day.
We're going to be uncovering actionable strategies so you can use these to boost your own well-being and really understand how to cultivate that feeling of satisfaction, that deep satisfaction. Okay, so let's dive into the first big idea here, the mind-body connection. I know we've all heard this phrase before, but the source material dives into some specifics that really caught my eye.
It goes so much deeper than just the idea that stress can cause physical symptoms. Like everybody knows about that. But for example, they talk about how exercise actually impacts specific neural pathways, not just reducing stress hormones, but actually promoting neurogenesis.
Neurogenesis.
Yeah. The growth of new brain cells
Oh, wow.
in the areas of the brain that are key for regulating our emotions.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about feeling good in the moment, it's about literally changing the structure of our brains to be more resilient and better able to kind of cope with those ups and downs of life.
Exactly. In fact, they cite studies showing that regular physical activity can be as effective as medication for treating mild to moderate depression.
Wow. It really highlights the power we have to shape our own well-being. And it's not just about hitting the gym right. The source also talks about the impact of nutrition.
Absolutely. They go beyond the usual eat your veggies advice and talk about the specific ways a balanced diet fuels our brain. For example, getting enough omega-3 fatty acids has been linked to better mood and cognitive function.
That makes a lot of sense. And then on the flip side, they talk about how chronic stress can actually damage our bodies, making it even harder to feel content.
That's where the two-way street of the mind-body connection comes in. If we're constantly stressed, it throws off our hormonal balance, it disrupts our sleep, weakens our immune system. All of this makes it that much more difficult to cultivate that internal sense of satisfaction.
It's like a vicious cycle. But knowing this, we can start to kind of break free, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they give some really practical advice for doing just that. They talk about building what they call a habit system. It's about starting small with one or two consistent actions, rather than trying to overhaul your entire lifestyle overnight.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed, like by the thought of going from being a couch potato to a marathon runner, it's about focusing on those small wins.
Exactly.
Like even just putting on your gym shoes every day, even if you don't actually work out, that can start to create that positive feedback loop in the brain.
It tells your brain, hey, we're taking care of ourselves. And over time, those small actions build momentum, leading to bigger changes.
So the takeaway here is that even if you don't feel like you have time for a complete well-being overhaul, there are simple things you can do today to start nurturing that mind-body connection. But what about those times when we just want to indulge in some good old-fashioned pleasure? Is there room for that in this pursuit of fulfillment?
That's a great question. And it leads perfectly into the next big idea from this deep dive, the distinction between pleasure and contentment.
This is where things get really interesting, because we all love those moments of pure joy,
Right.
whether it's a delicious meal, a beautiful sunset, or just a really good laugh.
Okay.
But is that fleeting pleasure enough to create lasting fulfillment?
That's the million-dollar question. They make a really clear distinction between those short-term sensory-driven pleasures and the deeper, more enduring feeling of contentment.
So it's about understanding the difference, like between that instant gratification, like indulging in your favorite dessert, and that deeper sense of satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your values.
Precisely. And they argue that our modern obsession with instant gratification has actually skewed our understanding of pleasure.
Oh, interesting.
We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to seek out those quick hits of dopamine, those temporary highs. But the problem is those feelings fade quickly, leaving us wanting more.
It's like that sugar rush we talked about earlier. It feels good in the moment, but it's not sustainable. So how does this relate to contentment then?
Well, contentment, they argue, is not about chasing those fleeting highs. It's about cultivating a sense of peace and satisfaction that comes from living a life that feels meaningful and purposeful.
So it's not about denying ourselves pleasure altogether. It's about understanding the role it plays in the bigger picture.
Exactly. And they offer a really insightful example to illustrate this point. They compare the momentary pleasure of watching your favorite TV show to the longer-lasting contentment that comes from nurturing strong relationships.
I like that. That's a great analogy. Watching TV can be a fun way to unwind, but it doesn't necessarily contribute to our overall sense of well-being in the same way that strong social connections do.
And those fulfilling relationships, they take time and effort to cultivate. They require us to show up authentically, to be present and engaged, and to prioritize connection over convenience.
Which is a lot harder than just binge watching the latest series, right?
Right.
But the rewards are so much greater.
Absolutely. And they argue that this same principle applies to other areas of our lives as well, whether it's pursuing a passion project, making time for nature, or simply engaging in activities that bring us joy and make us feel alive.
So it's about understanding the difference between those activities that provide a quick hit of pleasure and those that nourish our souls and contribute to a deeper sense of contentment.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here is that both have their place in a fulfilling life. It's not about denying ourselves pleasure. It's about integrating it into a balanced lifestyle that prioritizes those things that bring us lasting satisfaction.
It's like finding that sweet spot between indulgence and discipline, between enjoying those momentary pleasures and making choices that align with our values and contribute to our long-term well-being.
Exactly.
So we've been talking a lot about this balance, and I'm curious, in part 2, we'll dive into how we actually put this into practice. How do we shift from knowing this to actually living it?
That's where the rubber meets the road. And this source has some really practical advice for doing just that. We'll get into all that in part 2.
I can't wait. We'll see you then. So we've been unpacking this idea of finding balance between those quick hits of pleasure and the deeper, more lasting satisfaction of contentment. I'm curious, how does this source material suggest we actually put this into practice? Like, how do we shift from knowing this to actually living it?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And they emphasize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's not a checklist you could just tick off. But they do provide some really thought-provoking prompts to help us personalize these concepts.
Okay, so it's about figuring out what works for each of us individually, like what resonates with our values and our own unique circumstances.
Exactly. And one suggestion they offer is to revisit that idea of a habit system we talked about earlier. They encourage us to start small.
Yeah.
Maybe choose 1 or 2 areas where we want to make some positive changes.
Okay, so instead of trying to do a complete well-being makeover all at once, we can focus on building those healthy habits gradually. So maybe like committing to cooking a healthy meal at home 3 times a week, or adding just 15 minutes of movement to our day.
Exactly. Those incremental changes that feel manageable and sustainable. And they point out that even these small shifts can have a ripple effect on our overall well-being.
It's like creating that positive upward spiral. One healthy choice leads to another, and pretty soon we're feeling more energized, more focused, and more content.
And this ties back to another important point they make. Challenging those societal expectations that pressure us to be on all the time.
Right.
Remember how we talked about valuing our health enough to set boundaries even in social situations?
Yeah, that really resonated with me. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness and feel like we have to say yes to everything. But they're encouraging us to really prioritize our well-being, even if it means saying no sometimes.
It can be a difficult shift, but it's so crucial for creating that sense of balance and sustainability in our lives.
And speaking of balance, I love that analogy they use, comparing our lives to a game that needs fine-tuning. It takes some experimentation to find that sweet spot between challenge and reward, between pushing ourselves and giving ourselves permission to rest.
I love that analogy. It takes the pressure off perfection and allows us to approach this journey with a sense of curiosity and playfulness.
It's about figuring out what works for each of us individually, what energizes us, what brings us joy, what leaves us feeling drained.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And being willing to adjust our approach as we learn and grow. Because what worked for us a year ago might not be what we need today.
So it's an ongoing process, not a destination. It's about asking ourselves those key questions and being open to the answers, even if they change over time.
You got it. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about continually asking the right questions and being honest with ourselves about what we truly need and desire.
That makes a lot of sense. This whole deep dive has definitely sparked a lot of questions for me. Like, how do I integrate those moments of pure enjoyment into my life in a way that feels aligned with my values and my overall goals? How do I indulge without feeling guilty or like I'm going off track?
That's a great question. and one that they address as well, they suggest bringing a sense of mindfulness to our experiences of pleasure. It's not just about the activity itself, but about the intention behind it.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of just mindlessly scrolling through social media, we might ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Is it bringing me genuine joy, or am I just trying to avoid feeling something else?
Exactly. And that level of awareness can completely transform our relationship with pleasure. It allows us to savor those moments that truly matter, while letting go of the ones that don't serve us.
Okay, so we've talked about the mind-body connection, the balance between pleasure and contentment, and the importance of setting boundaries and challenging those societal expectations. As we kind of wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are some of the broader takeaways that stand out to you?
It's this interconnectedness between all these different aspects of well-being. We can't compartmentalize our physical health from our emotional state, or our ability to experience fulfillment. It's all woven together.
Like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. If we're not taking care of ourselves, body, mind, and spirit, we're not going to have the energy or the resilience to pursue those things that light us up.
Exactly. And this reminds us that fulfillment is not a destination. It's a journey. It's an ongoing process of learning, experimenting, and refining our approach as we go.
It's about embracing the messiness and the imperfection and recognizing that there's no one right way to do it.
Absolutely. And there's a real sense of freedom in that.
Definitely. It gives us permission to let go of those unrealistic expectations and just focus on showing up authentically as ourselves in all our glorious, perfectly imperfect humanness.
And that brings us to the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore how to truly embrace this journey of fulfillment and make it our own.
It's really been interesting unpacking all of this and exploring the connection between well-being and fulfillment.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how this source kind of turns conventional thinking on its head.
It really does. It's not about chasing some external goal. It's more about cultivating a sense of satisfaction from within.
Totally. And it's a process. It's not like a destination. It's ongoing. And that really stuck out to me, especially as we were talking about embracing imperfection and letting go of those expectations, those unrealistic expectations that we put on ourselves.
Yeah. It's about finding that balance between striving for growth, but also accepting ourselves for who we are right here, right now.
And that brings me to one final point from this document that I wanted to make sure we touch on. It's this idea of shifting our perspective from chasing fulfillment to cultivating it.
Oh, that's interesting. What do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that we often approach fulfillment as if it's something outside of ourselves, something we need to chase or achieve.
Egg, a butterfly, always just out of reach.
Exactly. But what if instead of chasing it, we focused on creating the conditions for it to just flourish naturally?
I love that. It's like we're the gardeners of our own well-being,
Yeah.
nurturing the soil, planting the seeds, and tending to our inner landscape.
Exactly. And those conditions, as we've been talking about, are things like prioritizing our physical and emotional health, finding that balance between pleasure and contentment, and giving ourselves permission to rest and recharge.
So it's not about reaching some perfect state of bliss, but more about creating a life that feels aligned and fulfilling, even with all of the inevitable ups and downs.
Yeah. It's about embracing the whole journey with all its complexities and remembering that we have the power to choose how we show up for it each and every day.
That is so powerful. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this. How can you apply all of this, all these principles of the mind-body connection, the balance between pleasure and contentment, and the importance of rest and recovery, to create a life that is both enjoyable in the moment and deeply fulfilling over time?
It's really about finding what works for you. So keep exploring these ideas and personalize them. Make them your own.
And we'll be here with you every step of the way. Until next time, keep diving deep.